one set to failure? Truly, let's be honest, is one set to failure all we need for muscle growth? Well, what's up, Governor? Coach Troy Brown here, apexphysiques.ca, IFBB Pro, and today we're talking about something really important that is still misunderstood. It confused me for many years, and it is one set to failure all you really need? One set to failure, truly, let's be honest, is one set to failure all we need for muscle growth? Well, so when we look at one set to failure, first of all, we got to go back to the beginning. Who started it? Who coined it? A lot of people know, well, most people think that Dorian Yates coined it. Well, let's go back a little bit further. Let's go back to Arthur Jones, the founder of Nautilus Equipment. He was the one, from my belief, that sort of used high intensity training and implemented this one set to failure approach. And then it sort of transitioned over to Mr. Mike Mentzer, who I consider a mentor. And he also put his sort of spin on it, if you will. And then it went over to Mr. Dorian Yates, 6-time Mr. Olympia, the one and only. He put his own little spin on it too. When you look at the DVD or the video for the older mature lifters that watch my material, and that is Blood and Guts on VHS, by the way, you'll notice that he only does one set to failure. But I'll come on to this in a second here. I think when you look at one set to failure, it's very confusing. The literature out there, if you look at the research, it's also very confusing also. So who's telling the truth? Does it work? Well, I think first of all, you need to figure out what works best for you. And that's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to stop you looking at other people's social media pages and watching social media videos and other fitness influencers that are on Instagram and YouTube, and figure it out for yourself. I think that's the best way to do it anyway, is to figure out what works best for you. So let's talk about my story and how I stumbled across this philosophy of high intensity training, the one set to failure principle. Well, back in England, I was a struggling bodybuilder. I wasn't doing very well. I was over dieted coming into shows, and I was struggling. In fact, in 2004, at Nationals in the UK, I finished dead last as a middleweight. I drove home that day to London from Nottingham, completely discouraged, thinking about quitting. And in that moment, I decided I'm going to do something different. I'm going to train differently, because at the time I was doing 6 days a week, 2-hour workouts, and I was really focused on becoming a better version of myself. And it wasn't till after that occasion, placing last place, it was like my prayers were being answered. I walked into my gym, Muscleworks in Bethnal Green, East London, for those that know that area, and I saw my mentor, who at the time, his name was Dushko, and he worked behind the desk at Muscleworks. And one day he pulled me aside after my workout, and he pulled me in the office and he sat me down and he said, Troy, and he's a Polish guy in his Polish accent, he's gone now, God rest his soul. He said to me, I see your discipline, I see your commitment, I see your desire, but you've been doing this now for over 2 years at this gym, and I haven't really seen you progress. I don't see your physique changing. I think most people in that situation would be offended. I actually used it as wisdom. I listened to every single word he said. And what he said to me, his next breath, he said, I've got a book for you, Troy. And if you read this book cover to cover and do exactly what the man says in the book, I promise you'll start to see changes to your physique. And that book was this, Mike Mentzer High Intensity Principles. This isn't the original copy that Dushko gave me, but I actually lost the original. But I bought this about a year ago. And it changed my life on training. It made me take a bird's eye view of my own training, and it got me to really think deeply about what I was doing. So I started implementing my training, going from 6 days a week down to 3 to 4 days a week. And miraculously, things started changing. Was I on anabolics? Yes, I was. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be completely open and transparent to those that watch my material. Yes, I was using anabolics at the time, but that wasn't what changed things. What changed things for me was my training approach, my style. I started to laser in on the details. I started looking at my recovery ability, And that's when things started changing. But I also started implementing the one set to failure principle. Now, the one set to failure is often misunderstood. A lot of people don't get it. And after using the high intensity principles, in 1 year, I weighed in at nationals when I finished dead last at 173 pounds. Over dieted, by the way. And then 1 year later, I came back to nationals, and guess what? I weighed in as a super heavyweight, weighing just over 230 pounds. Actually, no, I was about 228 pounds. Why am I telling you this? What changed? Most people say my gear cycle changed. That didn't change at all. My training and my nutrition changed immensely, but I put more effort towards restability. So if you notice in the video, if you watch online on YouTube, go and watch Blood and Guts, Dorian Yates in the infamous gym. It's an amazing place, by the way. It's such a shame it closed down. And it's called Temple Gym in Birmingham. And you'll notice when Dorian is in the gym and he's in black and white, right? The whole video's in black and white, it's filmed in black and white, has that hardcore element to it, which I absolutely love. And a lot of us British guys grew up to that DVD or that VHS. Anyway, you'll only see in the video that he only does one set to failure. Now, this is the confusion. Most people think that one set to failure isn't enough. What you don't see in the video with Dorian Yates in Blood and Guts, you don't see his previous sets. Now, one thing I'm going to add today is when you see these warm-up sets, and he does these warm-up sets, these are still pretty hard, intense sets. However, they're not taken to failure. Only on the last set is when he goes to failure, but you don't see the warm-up sets prior. So this is where the confusion is. So let's look at the research. What does the research say when it comes to one set to failure? It's very conflicting. A lot of meta-analysis will show, yes, you should go to failure, and then other meta-analysis will show you shouldn't go to failure. Now, if you pick up a book by this gentleman, Dr. Brad Schoenfield, PhD, he talks about that you don't have to go to failure. Here is the confusion. If you read very closely to what he's saying, he said you should get close to it. But he also says that you should do it only one time. When you look at the research and they show that one set, you don't need to do one set in order to grow, in order to build muscle, I look at the research and I ask myself, who did they do the studies on? Were they advanced trainees? Were they beginners? That's a massive variable that you need to think about. In this book, which is Max Muscle Plan 2.0, Brad Schoenfield talks about high rep ranges. I'm going to challenge you for a moment here. In the book, he talks about rep ranges going up to 15 and 30, sometimes even 40 reps. But anyway, what he's saying is if you can go to failure with these higher reps and training probably with 30% of your max load with these lighter loads, trying to get to failure around 30 reps, it's bloody hard. It's not easy. It's really, really challenging. I'm very used to myself going to failure anywhere between 8 and 12 reps. So I think what Brad Schoenfield is saying is that you don't have to go to failure, but you've got to get close to it. I just think you should go to failure regardless, and I'll come on to that in a second. Now, will the one set to failure approach work for you? That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Well, I really think it can, but there's some things that you really have to understand, and these are going to be the take-home messages for you that you can start applying these concepts in the gym. Number one, when you're doing the last set to failure, you've got to think about choosing the appropriate exercises. If you do it with the basic compounds, you're at high risk, you're asking for trouble. Stay away, go into failure on the barbell squat, on the heavy deadlifts, or any deadlift exercise for that matter. Even bench press, I would stay away from. Going to failure on bench press. At my age, 46, if I'm going to failure on the bench press, I'm asking for a pec tear, which I've already done in 2015 with very, very light load. So I'm very cautious now in my 40s. I don't do as much free weight exercises as I did in my 20s. I focus more on machines now, and I do a lot more higher rep ranges, but I still go to failure. Number two, one set to failure is all you truly need. You still need to do warm-up sets that are going to be pretty intense, but you're not going to go to failure on those warm-up sets. But you are going to use one set to failure approach depending on the right muscle group. For example, if you're doing cables, You could go to failure on cables. You could go to failure on machines. You could go to failure doing leg extensions, leg curls, peripheral muscle groups like the biceps and triceps and the calf muscles. You can go to failure on, but just be very cautious of the movement patterns you're doing. The big compounds, I would stay away from those movements. Even things like hack squat and leg press, you've got to be careful with going to failure on those movements. I look at failure, if I were training you, I would look at failure as, first thing we got to implement is form and execution is right up there with oxygen. It's the most important variable. And on top of that, as soon as your form breaks down, that's when I know that you've hit failure. There's no point training through bad form and trying to get more forced reps. That's just a bad idea. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to get injured. And lastly, number 3, don't leave the towel half wet. I see this time and time again in the gym. I'm not judging anybody because I don't know what their goals are, but I would assume that the goal is to build muscle. You wouldn't leave the towel half wet. And I feel that most people are training this way. They're not even increasing their effort in the gym, and they stay at this kind of plateau, if you will. Not a plateau, it's more linear. And their effort level is very linear all the way through their training, week after week, month after month, year after year. At some point, you've got to increase your intensity. You've got to get close to failure, or you have to hit failure depending on the right movement patterns. So don't leave the towel half wet. You wouldn't want to leave a towel half wet, would you? You want to squeeze every last drop out of that towel, and that's exactly what your training should be like. And that's why one set to failure is all you need. And why is one set to failure all you need? Because we don't have a lot of biochemical reserves in our body. So we have to be very cautious with volume, and we have to really focus on, if we are going to failure, which I believe is the only way to build muscle, depending on the movement pattern. I also think going to failure is very desirable. Here's an example. What is the most productive rep? Is it the first rep, or is it that last initial rep close to failure? It's obviously the rep that's close to failure. That's the most desirable rep. So I think it hurts either way, whatever rep scheme you're using, 6 to 12, 8 to 12, 15 to 30 reps, as I was saying earlier. It's going to hurt and it's going to be painful, but in order to build muscle, we have to create the stimulus. We have to get the growth stimulus into motion, and we have to basically wake up that signal in the body in order for growth production to happen. I love what Dorian Yates shared with me a few years ago. And he told me once that most people in the gym would just basically get a pencil and they would just tap, 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 tap away. No real intensity, just tapping set after set, rep after rep, and then they leave and they call it a day, not really pushing themselves. His analogy was, why don't you take a huge mallet and hit that sucker as hard as you can with one true hard set to failure? And he's right. So in a nutshell, in closing, go to failure is very desirable. You should do it. You should know what movements to do it on. And that's where a good training program could come into play. I could help you with this, by the way. Reach out to me, send me a message, find me on Instagram at Coach Troy Brown, and ask me about my training approaches to help you build solid muscle. And that way you're leaving no stone unturned. And more importantly, you are covering all hypertrophy volumes. Leave a comment below, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you've got any value from this video today. One set to failure is all you need. It's a good idea.